Hey, Professor Anton, as always, lots of interesting content in your video. As regards, I mean, I want to say a lot of things. I'm going to try to go quickly. Um, just so many. I think I missed your main point about you know we able to think about these thoughts of nothingness and going back and capturing or appropriating uh, the nothingness that was before the Big Bang. And it sounded good, but there was so much content in there that I ended up really getting distracted, so I have to listen to it again. But there's a lot of different quotes and different ideas, both mine that I've had and that other philosophers have had that I wanted to read. One was an interesting, I thought a kind of funny and insightful quote by Schopenhauer, who said that he's talking about thoughts and how thoughts come to us. And he said that sound, serious thoughts on worthy subjects cannot be conjured up arbitrarily and at any time. All we can do is to keep the path clear for them by banishing all futile, foolish, or vulgar ruminations, and by turning away from all humbug and tomfoolery. And so we can say that in order to think of something sensible, the quickest way is not to think of anything absurd or preposterous. We need only keep the field open to sound ideas, and they will come. Therefore, whenever we have a free moment with nothing to do, we should not forthwith seize a book, but should for once let our mind become tranquil, and then in it something good may easily arise. So it's interesting. Schopenhauer talks about nothingness or this absence as being the wellspring from which all somethings or all ideas arise. And of course, later on, Husserl would talk about intentionality as being always uh, you know, thought, desire, love of something. Intentionality is always directed toward its object. And so to say that, to add on to Husserl, we'd say that Schopenhauer says that it's the ground of nothingness out of which, or this the stillness out of which something emerges. And then, interestingly, uh, similar to what is said in the Sophist, Plato's Sophist 237b, Heidegger writes, he's talking about thinking and nothing. And he says that for as thinking of nothing, thinking, which in essence is always thinking about something, must act contrary to its own essence. So in a sense, Heidegger was saying that in that passage that thinking of nothing is, I mean, that where you sort of reach your limits in thought, because thought is always thought of something, right? Second thing is that so this is an interesting, because I know an interesting prelude, because I know you're into Heidegger. Um, in the Tao Te Ching, I think it's book 1, chapter 2. Uh, there's this emphasis on, and they said that vessels that are made of clay, perceptible clay, but it is actually their absence or their imperceptible hollow that makes them useful. Same thing with a wheel. You can see all the spokes of a let's say a horse carriage, a wheel, but it is actually the empty uh, the central axis of the hub, which allows the axle to go through, which makes it useful. And finally, in a house, we always pay attention to the walls and the things inside the house, but it's actually the absence within the house that makes it useful. And so the conclusion of that passage in the Tao Te Ching is that it is, let's see, how did I write it? It is the absence, while we notice the presence of things, it is the absence which produces effects and results. And that's mostly what I wanted to talk about here. I don't know how much time I have left, really, but uh, Ortega y Gasset writes about how beyond the horizon we have this feeling of what is beyond, uh, outside of our room. So if you're sitting inside of a room, you have a feeling that there is a world outside there. There's not just some gaping nothingness. Um, and I want to read something from that if I have time. Uh, he says, um, he's talking about the sky and how the sky is before it's all blue and nice and pretty to look at. It was first of all something for us. It had a reference. It told us something. It told us something about what was coming in the future. Usually, you could say it was the clouds, or told us a brooding storm was coming, or the cyclical nature of the weather told us about the seasons, and we interpreted ourselves in terms of this. Um, he says that the blue sky does not begin by being up there so high and quiet and blue, so impassive and indifferent to us. The sky begins originally by acting on us as a very extensive repertory of signals that are useful for our life. Its function, its action, which makes us heed it and therefore see it, is its active role as a semaphore. Um, and then he goes on to say that, but the sky's telling, signaling, warning, suggesting activity does not stop here. It was not some superstitious primitive, but Kant himself, and not very long since as these things go, who in 1788 summed up all his proud knowledge by saying, quote, "There are only two things," Kant saying this, "there are only two things that flood the soul with ever new amazement and veneration, which only increase the oftener and more persistently we meditate on them, the starry sky above me and the moral law within me." And then Ortega goes on to write, that is, in addition to the sky's signaling all these useful changes to us, these useful but trivial changes of weather, hours, days, years, millennia, apparently its moving nocturnal presence with the stars trembling in some impenetrable agitation, also signals to us the gigantic existence of the universe, of its laws, of its profundities, and the absent presence of someone or some all-powerful being who calculated it, created it, ordered it, adorned it. There is no question that Kant's phrase is not simply a phrase, but that it beautifully describes an essential phenomenon of human life. In the dark of a clear night, the star-filled sky winks at us with countless eyes, seems to want to tell us something. We understand what Heine is suggesting when he says that the stars are golden thoughts in the mind of night. Their winking, too, minute in each separate star and immense in the entire vault, is a permanent stimulus for us to transcend the world that is our environment and find the radical universe. That's it from Man and People, page 71. Um, and Ortega also makes this distinction between an environment and a world. The environment is sort of like what's immediately perceptible around us. The world is that surplus of meaning which goes on indefinitely but yet becomes more and more vague as you go outward. There's the street outside, the rest of the city, the state, the country, the planet, the universe, all around me. And that's sort of what makes up the world to an extent, maybe minus the universe. Um, and but I want to talk about, I mean, absence. I mean, there's so many things I wrote here. Absence as constituted and constitutive. So a lot of people are thinking, I think, of nothingness, this room-making nothingness, this absence as um, perhaps like an empty nothingness. But there's also a kind of constitutive nothingness, which is talked about by different philosophers in different ways. But there's also the I mean, there's also the nothingness that creates an openness, which you say is a room-making nothingness. I think it's related to that. I don't want to say that the nothing is in the something. I mean, I'm not sure what that would mean. I want to leave that to you to specify. But the nothing creates an openness, allowing for novel interactions to take place. This is the kind of constitutive nothingness that I would want to talk about. Um, for instance, there are when we gain new understandings of other cultures, we open up a new space for understanding each other, for new novel interactions to take place. When we open up new spaces in cities, or different businesses or parks, or even something like uh, embassies, where you have this like neutral zone where you can go. There's no war in this neutral zone. These are open spaces that open up